Hello, and welcome to the Stoics. In our penultimate week, week 10, we're going to look at the absurdist writer, thinker, and yes, philosopher, although we might disagree on this, Albert Camus. Now, this week comes as a request from you all. On the course, I sent out a link to a poll. Originally, I wanted to have Umar Khayyam's The Rubaiyat, which I think is a beautiful work, not just in the Fitzgerald translation, but just in itself too. But it seemed to be the kind of the fatalism in the Rubaiyat kind of made me think that I didn't know how to incorporate it into a conventional course on Stoic thinking. And then through our discussions and my reflections on the course over the weeks, I've been thinking more and more about the difficulties facing Stoicism. And that's why I thought it was especially interesting to suggest to you guys that we do a week on Camus and the absurd and the challenges that potentially face this Stoic view that the universe is harmonious, that it is accommodating to our reason. Camus and the Myth of Sisyphus, which is the set text for this week, which this recording will talk about, is on a surface level very much against this view. It's very anti-Stoic in the providence that certainly our Greek Stoics seem to fall back on. As we'll see, there are some Stoic resonances to what Camus has to say. I'm going to explore this later in relation to Seneca. But by popular demand, you asked for a week on the absurd. So what we're going to do in this week is we're going to think about some of the challenges to Stoic thinking through Camus. Also, we're going to bring in briefly Friedrich Nietzsche as well. Let's see what still stands. Let's go. So, this is the prevailing image that we might have of Camus, of Sisyphus, the Greek mythic figure who is condemned to roll the same rock up a hill it goes down and he has to push up again. Camus' injunction, Camus' call, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. What does that mean, that kind of reveling, dare we say joy, in a thoroughly dissatisfying and trapped life, trapped world? Is that a kind of rebuke to Stoicism, to the kind of easygoing harmony that we sometimes see in their works, or in the sense that there is a kind of tranquility to be found in life by simply amending our own perceptions? Or maybe Sisyphus is a Stoic. The agenda is this. We're going to begin by talking about Camus, Camus' life, Camus' times. We're then going to look at the concept of the absurd. We're going to dwell on the absurd for a while, and this is where Friedrich Nietzsche is going to come in. I also want to talk about Franz Kafka and Fyodor Dostoevsky. I mean, Camus talks about them anyway, but I also think they're going to be very useful for our reflections this week. In a couple of parts of the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus seems to suggest that we've kind of got a rubbish choice, which is faced with the absurdity of the meaninglessness of the universe, of the world that is indifferent to us. We have either suicide or we have facile hope. I mean, there's a third way, but we're going to look at this, comparison. Why does suicide become inevitable as a feeling, as a volition? But when I was putting together this week, you're going to think I'm hopeless. I ended up coming to the view that I actually think Camus, there's a lot of Stoic resonances in his thinking. Camus is somebody who studied ancient Greek philosophy at university level. He was interested in Plotinus, a Neoplatonist. But there's other resonances. We'll talk about those. And then finally, we're going to look at Camus' ideas about rebellion, being a rebel. And one thing that is going to be interesting about this is that maybe it might offer us a bridge to the problems that we've kind of had at different points about Stoicism's lack of social and political commitments. Maybe in Camus' sense of our interdependence and how our identities and our agencies kind of formed through acts of collective rebellion. Maybe there's a route through here. Maybe this takes us away from the quietism that seemed like it might be a problem in some of our earlier thinkers. Let's see how we go. Okay. In this bit, we're going to talk about Camus' life. Some of you might already know Camus. You might know Camus well. You might have read The Myth of Sisyphus before. You might have read some of his novels, like The Outsider, or some of the translators, Stranger, or The Plague, right in these times. Let's kind of land in Camus' world. Here he is, always looking very handsome and sharply dressed. A quote to begin. Camus says, "The realization that life is absurd cannot be an end, but only a beginning. Cannot be a point of despair, of resignation, of the resignation of Kohelet, narrator of Ecclesiastes, lamenting the transience of all things under the sun. That life is absurd doesn't close down thought, but necessitates thought. It is something that forces thinking into being. It necessitates thinking. Maybe it's part of what the Stoics call catalepsis, a grasping, an impression that transforms the way we see the world. But there's something deeply unstoic about things being absurd, being incomprehensible, being indifferent to us. What do we do with that? And how does Camus' work offer a way of thinking all this through?" Here is Camus again. Now, Albert Camus maybe differs in the pantheon of Western towering intellects in many respects. One that we could begin with is his radical political commitments, his participation in the French resistance during his lifetime, his broader kind of left-wing political activism that never really fitted into one easy political mold, was very left-leaning, but was kind of concerned about the authoritarian tendencies that seem to be within different organized communist parties. Camus, born in French Algeria, sympathetic to the Algerian independence movement, but certainly not willing to endorse or encourage the terrorism that was being widely carried out back then, which of course was famously supported by Frantz Fanon, the radical black psychiatrist, in works like The Wretched of the Earth, which itself, when it came out in 1961, came with a really gushing preface, encouraging and endorsing violence from Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus' former companion. It kind of drifted apart. It isn't just his political commitments. Camus, like I mentioned, born in French Algeria in 1913, has a very poor upbringing. It would be wrong to call him middle class. His parents are pieds noirs, black feet, poor French people, basically, who travelled to Algeria during the 19th century for greater economic opportunities. If a comparable thing, if you want to think about this in terms of British history, think about kind of poorer people from poorer regions of England or lots of Scotland that travelled to Canada or Australia or New Zealand. Within the colonies, within the colonial countries, the white settlers, have more rights than the local people. In the case of Algeria, the Berbers, the Arabs. But Camus experiences poverty in other ways as well. This is Here Combat is a newspaper that he edited during the Second World War, a resistance newspaper. You can kind of see elements of that if you look at, well, if you know much French, in the stuff around the headline. Camus is brought up in a maternal household. He never meets his father. His father dies very early on in the First World War at the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Camus is brought up in a poor part of Algiers. During his kind of teenage years, one kind of anecdote that's often told about Camus is that he was very good at football, very good at swimming. Could have been a footballer. This is also true of Jacques Derrida as well. But what stops Camus from being a footballer is that he gets tuberculosis when he's 17. So this will be in the year 1930. We can imagine this living in a poor neighbourhood, very little income, a limited amount of financial support from some male relatives like Camus' uncle, who he ends up moving in with, who's a butcher. But an environment of kind of poverty, of illness, clipped wings, clipped ambitions. Camus wanted to become a footballer but couldn't because of tuberculosis. He studies and he's able to get into a good secondary school near Algiers. He gets a scholarship, and he's kind of mentored a bit by one of his teachers, a philosophy teacher. But later on he's only able to study part-time because there isn't enough money in the household. He does all sorts of odd little jobs. He's a clerk, a private tutor. He kind of takes up different posts. He ends up being able to go to University of Algiers, 1933, gets a degree in philosophy. He has a real interest in people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and what might kind of describe as pessimistic philosophers. He's also interested in novelists, Kafka, Dostoevsky. They'll emerge again. Towards the late 1930s, in Algeria, Camus becomes more involved in the Communist Party there for a time. He also becomes very interested in theatre. He shares an interest in theatre with Frantz Fanon. Again, Fanon is just a very interesting figure, post-colonial theorist. Also ends up being in Algeria about 15 years later, 25 years later. And this interest in the theatre, of course, comes up in the discussion of drama in the Myth of Sisyphus. Not long after he moves to Paris, where he gets a job as a newspaper editor, the Second World War breaks out. Camus wants to sign up to the French military effort, but he cannot because of his medical record, because of his TB. So he ends up kind of fleeing, and he ends up being involved in the French resistance. He's got this background in journalism, really, and his kind of role within the resistance. You might be picturing him, carrying guns and firing at the enemy, staying the way that a philosopher like Jean Cavalier, a keen Spinozist, did. But Camus is involved more in the banned newspaper combat, where he kind of writes under lots of different pseudonyms and produces really kind of like rabble-rousing kind of writings and writings, encouraging the French to continue resisting in different ways. And this, after the war, will make him a hero, because many French will discover it was Camus who was writing these wonderful editorials, who was writing these blistering calls to action. Camus has a special place in France, partly as a result of this, just after the Second World War. And this is also around the time that a lot of his major works start coming out as well. The image on the right, I should explain, is a fake ID that Camus had. You can kind of see this, here, it's kind of where he's born. I think he's made himself out to be a little bit older than he actually is here. Yeah, he's born in 1913, but this is born in Lebanon, somewhere around Paris. This is Camus kind of later in years. And this is part of a more famous set of images. I think Camus in New York at this time. So Camus kind of comes to the fore after the Second World War, when it becomes known about his work in the resistance, and then when a lot of his own kind of works kind of come out in different ways. The plague, which has been kind of read and discussed in relation to coronavirus, is about a plague that sweeps the Algerian city of Oran, comes out in 1947. And it's interesting with Camus that the novels are kind of explorations of absurdist philosophy, absurdism. We sometimes think of Camus, or Camus sometimes described as an existentialist, and he discusses upper existentialists in a work like The Myth of Sisyphus, which is from the year 1942. But Camus saw himself as a thinker of the absurd, and therefore an absurdist. That life is absurd, but that doesn't mean that life is inherently meaningless. It means rather that it compels us to kind of find meaning in it, while kind of recognizing the indifference, the transience of the life that we are in, and to enjoy that, to live fully, live maximally. So the play comes out in 1947, The Myth of Sisyphus 1942. And so it's after the Second World War that he becomes more and more well known as a public intellectual. here he is looking very kind of cool on the left. And then on the right, at a dinner party with Maria Caceres, one of his mistress. So Camus also has 2 children during the late 1940s. He marries twice in his life. But one of the things that biographers enjoy discussing about this man was his numerous affairs. His love of women in different ways. There's a biopic about Camus that came out about 10 years ago, but it's not very good. You'll find a lot about Camus' life on Wikipedia. It's a full life, it's a rich life. And then, of course, here are his 2 children, Camus later in years. But there's Camus' death, his untimely death in the year 1960, dies in a car crash. There's a conspiracy theory that he was deliberately killed for criticizing the Soviet Union, for being an unusual kind of Western Marxist who would do this, and was therefore assassinated. Camus apparently had a train ticket in his coat, but he travels in the car with his publisher. Why did this happen? This conspiracy theory isn't widely believed, but it's interesting, isn't it? We don't know what would he have done had he lived into the 1960s. How would his thinking and writing have developed? He dies only at the age of 47. He's also the second youngest winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957 as well. Something that he also didn't really expect at the time. So a remarkable man. Somebody who we could try and place in different contexts. We could try and call him an existentialist. We could try and fit him into kind of resistance to fascism. We could see him as an Algerian, but none of these categories really work for Camus. He's always thinking his way out of them, thinking his way beyond them. He's always questioning them. That's what makes his thinking, in my view, so invigorating, so interesting. The fact that he is always unorthodox. There's always something heretical happening in his writing. There's always activity happening in his thought. He's a very interesting figure to read. So, just the kind of the facts about him, just coming up on the screen here. The Rebel. We'll talk about The Rebel later. That comes out in 1951. The Stranger, The Outsider, 1942 as well. Okay. Here's some of these aren't all first editions, some book covers. La Peste, The Plague on the left, and The Stranger, The Outsider on the right. There's The Rebel, wonderful, one of these kind of 60s penguin paperbacks. The Rebel is a great work, by the way. And then there's just another collection, some of his plays as well, like Caligula, around the absurd. And you're not a proper philosopher. You're not a really engaging philosopher unless you inspire people to get lots of tattoos, right? Well, you notice that we didn't have one for Spinoza. There are some Spinoza tattoos, but for Camus there are bloody tons. And here are just some, usually around the myth of Sisyphus. Imagine Sisyphus happy. It's interesting how philosophers speak to people that may not be philosophers. Gilles Deleuze talks about Spinoza being a philosopher for non-philosophers, for musicians and artists. And Camus, Marcus Aurelius, I would say, is another. Both two thinkers who have really quite widely translated into the concerns of everyday life for many people. Been meaningful for lots of reasons. Let's start exploring this in a little bit more depth. Okay, so part 2, we're going to look at the concept of the absurd. But we're not going to get to Camus straight away, because we're going to talk instead, just briefly, about one of my favourite films, which is Orson Welles' rendition of Franz Kafka's The Trial. Here is a still from it. We're not going to talk about Orson Welles, I'm just deceiving you here. We're going to talk about The Trial by Kafka, but not only that, we're going to talk about a specific part, a parable that appears towards the end of the novel The Trial, called Before the Law. This is when Joseph K goes into the church, and the priest kind of tells him this kind of cryptic story about suddenly not being able to get through a door, and they're waiting until they die. This parable called Before the Law, Kafka actually writes before the trial, and it exists. It is published separately. It's very interesting. I'll just read you a short bit of it. You might already be familiar with it, but maybe if you're not, this is a key part. So Kafka writes, and we're using this, you're thinking, why I'm telling you this, it's we're going to get into what the absurd might be. Franz Kafka writes, before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper there comes a man from the country and prays for admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot grant admittance at the moment. The man thinks it over and asks if he will be allowed in later. It is possible, says the doorkeeper, but not at the moment. We skip on a little bit. These are the difficulties the man from the country has not expected. The law, he thinks, should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone. But as he now takes a closer look at the doorkeeper in his fur coat, with his big sharp nose and long, thin, black Tartar beard, he decides that it is better to wait until he gets permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit down at one side of the door. There he sits for days and years. It skips on a bit. What do you want to know now? Asks the doorkeeper. You are insatiable. Everyone strives to reach the law, says the man. So how does it happen that for all these many years no one but myself has ever begged for admittance? The doorkeeper recognizes the man has reached his end, and, to let his failing senses catch the words, roars in his ear. No one else could ever be admitted here, since this gate was made only for you. I am now going to shut it. Which is all wonderfully cryptic and open to manifold interpretations. And this is another image still from the trial. Now, one conventional way of reading this parable before the law is about Joseph K., the man from the country, but more widely, human beings, humanity being no longer able to access transcendent universal meanings of the sort that were provided by religion. Here you might be thinking of Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea that God is dead. And good, if you're thinking of that, great. That's a good connection you've made. That's something that you should keep in mind. That there's a mystery here, mystery in which universal meaning and life, existence, nature being meaningful to us, for us, has been lost. It did exist, but it's now been lost. We could have had access to it, but now we do not have access to it. That's just one conventional interpretation. Walter Benjamin, writing about Kafka, puts it like this, quote, so we have before us a mystery which we cannot comprehend. And precisely because it is a mystery, we have had the right to preach it, to teach the people that what matters is neither freedom nor love, but the riddle, the secret, the mystery to which they have to bow without reflection and even against their conscience. Now, floating around Benjamin's remarks is the role of mystery. I think I've probably given you this quote before from Garcia Lorca, that only mystery makes us live, which is suitably cryptic and mysterious and wonderful, really, in our yearning, not for reason, but for the very opposite, for wonder, for what we do not yet understand. Now, I want to pair up Kafka's parable here with another parable, a parable that appears in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which Camus does talk about in Myth of Sisyphus, but he talks about a different part of it, a different part of this long novel. I'm thinking here of the parable of the Grand Inquisitor, and the image here is from a kind of illustration of the Brothers Karamazov. Here is another different artist of the Grand Inquisitor. Now, this kind of appears as though it's a separate thing to the story that two of the characters, I think it's Ivan and Alyosha, are then like debating the meaning of. They kind of derive different meanings from it. It's the story of Jesus Christ, who returns to Seville during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And in the story, Christ has come back and he's doing all sorts of miracles, and the crowds are astonished, and it's amazing. This is the second coming of the Messiah. But what happens, it says that the church are threatened by this figure, because this figure of Jesus seems to kind of be presenting a message, an understanding of God, and union with God, which has no reference to the existing church in all of its violence and all of its authoritarian and even totalitarian nature. And so Jesus is arrested by the church and locked up. And so the Grand Inquisitor, somebody who leads the Inquisitions, which in Spain were usually directed against people accused of being secret Jews and secret Muslims, visits Jesus and then tells him, look, Jesus, we don't need you anymore. The church works without you. We do not need the kind of love that you're offering, because we offer a response. Human beings aren't ready for the message that you're preaching, Jesus. Now the church offers something different. It offers the kind of sweeping meaning that Kafka was suggesting had been lost in his parable. This is a quote from what the Grand Inquisitor has to say. Don't worry, we're going to get to Camus in a moment. And it's about, I think it's about freedom, or the burden of freedom, which the church seeks to lift, to divest people of. The Inquisitor says, and that was what we did. We corrected your great deed and founded it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. And people were glad that they had once been brought together into a flock, and that at last from their hearts had been removed such a terrible gift, which had brought them so much torment. Were we right to teach and act thus, would you say? Did we not love mankind when we so humbly admitted his helplessness, lightening his burden with love, and allowing his feeble nature even sin, but with our permission? Why have you come to get in our way now? And why do you gaze at me so silently and sincerely with those meek eyes of yours? So what happens at the end, some of you will know this parable, is that the figure of Jesus just looks silently and lovingly at the Inquisitor as he kind of, justifies, taking away people's kind of freedom to feel torment. He looks on, and then at the end he kind of silently kisses him on the cheek and leaves. And the parable is interpreted in different ways. But it goes back to something that Camus himself kind of sketches out in the Myth of Sisyphus, which is an argument that Dostoevsky wanted to present about meaning. Now, there's a part of the Brothers Karamazov which was translated into French but not English. One of the remarks, if God is dead, all things are permitted. This is, it's translated into French as is, and so Sartre and others, make a big deal out of this. But what Dostoevsky seems to kind of be arguing is that there's something very dangerous about this proposition that God might be dead. It leads to the suicide of Kirillov. It leads to the murder of Raskolnikov. And it goes against the kind of spiritual beauty and innocence envisioned by Prince Mishkin in the novel The Idiot, or in Alyosha, the character in Brothers Karamazov, the youngest brother who has this kind of spiritual nature and becomes like a monk towards the end. Now Camus, would see this as a bit of a cop-out. I'm sorry, I should put this in a little more philosophical way. Now what we're getting, what we're losing, I should say, in the loss of meaning is a loss not just in people's kind of conventional beliefs in the creeds, the prayer books of the Christian church, but of a wider structure of nature in which man, with a capital M, has a place, like in this image here of the great chain of being from the early modern period. That nature is ordered in a hierarchy. You have God at the top, you can see God there, and then below God, you see the chain going down, don't you? Well, I have kind of like I think they're archangels, and then there's lower angels with wings. Then you've got your human beings on the next rung. Then I don't know how they've worked this out, but birds come first, then fish, then animals, and then trees, and then rocks and minerals, and then you have hell. Everything has a station, everything has a purpose. It's this kind of purpose, status, this wider view that nature can be rendered intelligible to human reason, which is a Stoic view, although it's a Stoic view in a different way to this. This is what I see Kafka suggesting as having been lost, and Dostoevsky is being very disturbed by the fact that it could be lost. Now, we talked about this in relation to Spinoza last week. Spinoza's God, who is also Einstein's God. Spinoza very much overturns this kind of human-centered view of God, of what God is, God being like a human being, God being transcendent and not immanent. We talked about this last week. And we also kept in mind here some of the resonances that Spinoza's kind of understanding of the centrality of desire has. Well, there were some of Stoic thinking in terms of conatus and affinity of our own constitution, but there's also a bearing on later thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, the centrality of the will, Freud with libido as well. But I just want to make a comment here about Nietzsche in particular, because Nietzsche is an interesting one in terms of the kind of the potential challenge that might arise. We're going to see the come in a moment, but from Nietzsche to Stoic thinking, with this idea that nature takes a certain form, takes a certain mold. How do we understand that? What is meant by that? So Nietzsche is skeptical. He's skeptical about Stoicism. He's skeptical, and this is a skepticism that he shares, about Schopenhauer's work, that the only response to will is that we try to negate will. We try to kind of place or insert will in a way that no longer causes us suffering. Nietzsche says this is dangerous. This is life-denying. If we try and subdue will in the same way that for the Stoics we try to make ourselves indifferent to so many things, then we remove, well, it's not just we remove, we deny what our natures are, and our natures are striving, desiring, active, willing things. We cannot be indifferent so much in the way that the Greek Stoics suggest. That is not possible. Let me give you a quotation from Beyond Good and Evil, where Nietzsche kind of explicitly challenges the Stoics. Nietzsche, this is from chapter 1 of Beyond Good and Evil. I found this translation online, so it's a little bit old-fashioned. Nietzsche says, quote, and he's addressing the Stoics here, "You desire to live according to nature? Oh, you noble Stoics, what fraud of words! Imagine to yourselves a being like nature, boundlessly extravagant, boundlessly indifferent, without purpose or consideration, without pity or justice, at once fruitful and barren and uncertain. Imagine to yourselves indifference as a power. How could you live in accordance with such indifference? To live, is not that just endeavouring to be otherwise than this nature? Is not living, valuing, preferring, being unjust, being limited, endeavouring to be different? And granted that your imperative, living according to nature, means actually the same as living according to life, how could you do differently? Why should you make a principle out of what you yourselves are and must be? In reality, however, it is quite otherwise with you. While you pretend to read with rapture the canon of your law in nature, you want something quite the contrary, you extraordinary stage players and self-deluders. In your pride, you wish to dictate your morals and ideals to nature herself, and to incorporate them therein. You insist that it shall be nature according to the Stoa, and would like everything to be made after your own image, as a vast eternal glorification and generalism of Stoicism. With all your love for truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, and with such hypnotic rigidity, to see nature falsely, that is to say, stoically, that you are no longer able to see it otherwise, and to crown all, this is where the translation sounds really old-fashioned, some unfathomable superciliousness gives you the bedlamite, like Bedlam, hope that because you are able to tyrannize over yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny, nature will allow herself to be tyrannized over. Is not the Stoic a part of nature?" And he goes on and on and on like this. Now, Nietzsche presents Epicurus as a favourable counterfigure to the Stoics. And you might want to think of what is it that what annoys Nietzsche about the Stoics? Well, it's this kind of difference and indifference. indifference to will, indifference to striving, indifference to the passions. It's also the Stoic view, and this is from the Greek Stoics really, well actually no, also the Roman Stoics, of providence, that there are gods, that there is an underlying kind of harmony or harmonious direction and order to the universe. Nietzsche wouldn't accept this. Like with Epicurus, adopted the atomic theory of Democritus, that what nature is atoms swirling and colliding in space. There is no more meaning than that. There are no gods, says Epicurus. Gods are simply the product of our own fears about death, through which organized religion and superstitions emerge. Spinoza is, well, a friend, colleague of mine, Demetrius Vardilakis, is exploring the idea that Spinoza was influenced by Epicurus. This could be an interesting way of thinking about how he differs from the Stoics that we talked about last week. We might want to keep in mind what Nietzsche is saying here in relation to Camus in this level, in terms of indifference, but also in terms of how we react. I want you to think here, if you know it, or if you don't know it, just look it up at some point. In the announcement of the death of God, that occurs in Nietzsche's work. I think it's in The Gay Science. The parable, is it the parable of the madman? I feel like I'm getting this completely wrong. Yeah, the parable of the madman. Where the madman who kind of announces that God is dead and we have killed him, and he goes around with a lantern. This is kind of depicted in this wonderful evocative image on the right. Yeah. Where is God? I will tell you. We have killed him. We are all his murderers. Blah blah blah. That. Well, I mean, Camus is very much inspired by Nietzsche. And maybe Camus perhaps is, taking the baton, carrying the lantern off Nietzsche's Madman 60 years previously. Parable of the Madman, The Gay Science, 1882, Myth of Sisyphus, 1942. Of how individuals respond to the loss of meaning, to the absurd. That's what Camus calls it. But there's something very similar happening in both thinkers. Okay, that was a little Nietzsche digression of this class on the absurd. Going back to Spinoza, when we were thinking about Spinoza last week, we were looking at the role of desire. And Spinoza's kind of really, I find it really refreshing ethics, which deals with human beings not as we would like them to be, but as they are. Human beings, like all things in nature, driven and determined by prior causes that they usually do not understand. Kind of colliding from one thing to another, one encounter to another. Often not aware of what causes the things that they feel, the affects, the ideas of their bodies, affections or encounters. Not aware of what causes their desires. Being animated by appetites, striving to exist in their own state, which take the form of desires in their minds, in our minds. Desires often involve judgments about what we believe is good for us in different ways, which can lead to all sorts of contrary effects. I talked about smoking last week. Smoking, drinking, all sorts. The many ways in which some of the most deep and active desires are the most tragic ones. Here we might think of addiction. We might also think of what André Breton called mad love, amour fou. Maybe that's what makes Camus, like Spinoza, like Montaigne, invigorating, because they don't follow the mold of a figure like Zeno of Citium. They're not ascetics. They're not frugal in their feeling. There's something in their outlook which is open to the passions, to the disturbance of the passions, and is educated by those passions and loves to love in that respect. Now, how do we place this within the absurd and absurdism? Well, I've kind of sketched out a few coordinates already. Let's start looking into what Camus has to say. We're going to drift into Camus here. So, I want you to think for a moment how you would define absurdity. What if something is absurd? What does that mean? Well, I suppose on an everyday level, something absurd is something that is kind of contradictory, is nonsense, doesn't make sense. Now, when Camus sketches out the absurdity. If we think about it in terms of the coordinates here, like Kafka, like Nietzsche, what we're kind of seeing is the struggle of a human being, of an individual for meaning in the world. Wow, I should have put the animation one at a time. A struggle which is unsuccessful at first. The individual wants meaning. The individual wants to get through the doors, but they're not given access. The madman announces the death of God, but we have killed him. But what comes next? The new men, the new thinkers, the new spirits, as Nietzsche calls them. That's not clear. Now, Camus also sees absurdity as a confrontation between our minds and their striving for meaning, their need for meaning, and an indifferent world. But the status of the indifferent world, or the indifferent universe, is also like the status of an authority that does not allow us or grant us meaning. This is a struggle for meaning that is tragic, which at first does not succeed, and it reflects a wider period, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, in which those meanings, like morality, like religion, have been under immense strain. Darwin, the world wars, genocides in different ways, deep doubts about the power of civilization, about the project of the Enlightenment. You think about what Camus is doing around this time. Think about the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, the Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I think comes out in 1947. Deep doubts about where reason goes, whose reason, or for Camus, what law, whose law. There's a deep challenge here. How do we make meaning in a meaningless world? And how are we going to do it if we've been deprived access to so much? If we're going to affirm our own selves, self-determination, how do we do that in a way that involves genuine self-knowledge? Or projects, I'm using a phrase from Simone de Beauvoir, that are genuinely empowering, genuinely nourishing, genuinely interesting, and not just a load of rubbish. That are not just simply being a busybody, wasting our time in the way that Seneca would, tell us not to waste our time. How do we live meaningfully in a world without meaning? That's the challenge. Let's look at some images that bring this to light. Being caught in a maze, a labyrinth, no escape, hunted by a minotaur. Our own fears, our paranoia, our doubts, our search for meaning, our need for what is always elusive. MC Escher is a good visual artist to have in mind when we think about different perspectives on the same space, which are contradictory, which are impossible, which are still deeply stimulating and fascinating. You spend so much time looking at Escher's impossible images. There's also the absurdity on a more humdrum level of life now or life recently. There was a great Facebook group a few years ago called Boring Dystopia. Had images like this of these signs, electric signs and whatnot, just not working, being contradictory. Work hard so you can shop harder. An image from, I think from a shopping centre. Or in this hotel, that the books are for display purposes only. Oh, okay. I mean, obviously this is slightly different what Camus has to say, but just give some boring dystopia. Just Google it. So this question: how do you define absurdity? This is what Camus is dealing with. This is what the Myth of Sisyphus is investigating. And facing the absurd is a common theme in his novels and his essays. They all kind of share the same ethos, don't they? It's interesting to think about Camus in that respect. There's often a bit of discomfort about even calling Camus a philosopher because he doesn't explore, demonstrate his ideas in much analytical depth whatsoever. He explores different positions. He thinks about their consequences. He explores them in relation to literature and art. But my view is that there is a philosophy here in its outlook, in its emphasis on us forging our own outlook, and in this view, and in this attention to how we live, living ethically. Camus is sometimes called a moralist, concerned with morality. I think that's a good way of describing something like the Myth of Sisyphus. How do we live with the absurd in a way that isn't irresponsible, isn't a way that doesn't result in literal or intellectual suicide? In the preface to the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus says this, quote, "The fundamental subject of the Myth of Sisyphus is this: it is legitimate and necessary to wonder whether life has a meaning." This isn't just armchair pontificating. All of us need meaning in different ways. It's just that sometimes we look for that meaning in different ways at different stages in our life. Maybe for different lengths of time, sometimes not very much time at all. And Camus is interested in the point before we find meaning, the point before we become born again religious figures or Spinozists or whatever we become born as. It's that moment where we don't know. Camus says, quote, "At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." We'll come back to this phrase more and more, the unreasonable silence. The indifference. Remember the Stoics that encourage us to be indifferent to the world, but here the world is indifferent to us. Camus says further, the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. Of things as they are and things as we need them to be, if we kind of invert the saying of Spinoza. It's a confrontation, it's active, and in that confrontation, thinking begins. But the problem for Camus is that very often thinking soon after dies. Let's now look at part 3, where Camus talks about the inevitability of suicide, feeling suicidal. So the work kind of presents this question early on: what is the key problem facing philosophy and why? Now, in straight up kind of philosophy from the pre-Socratics, up to people like John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, it isn't about is life worth living. It's about the conditions of knowledge, the foundations for knowledge, and what knowledge consists of. That's what, the debates around, is knowledge something that is known a priori, known through rational exercise and deduction, or is it learned through observation of the world and our reflections about them? These debates take up much of the history of philosophy. They involve Plato and Aristotle. They involve Descartes and Hume and Kant. And this is a very different kind of philosophy to the Stoics, and it's a very different kind of philosophy to Camus. And in some respects, it's a different kind of philosophy to Spinoza, because these are figures that aren't just interested in the conditions of knowing, but they're interested in the conditions of living and how we live, and philosophy being part of a way of life. We could say that there's two trajectories in that respect. There's a trajectory of Socrates, Socrates who doesn't present positive doctrines but interrogates others for their inconsistencies, locates aporia, and so on. Socrates, who inspires that should be associated with the Cynics. And then with Zeno, kind of influenced as much by the Cynics as by Socrates. Socrates, whose philosophy is a way of life, and this idea of the philosopher's way of life is so vital to Seneca, to Epictetus. And it's this tradition that then becomes lost really in different ways. Lost with the rise and the emergence of Platonism, Platonic ideas over Christianity, Augustine and others. Then Aristotle in the medieval church, scholasticism. But it kind of resumes again this tradition, I would say, in the work of someone like Montaigne, who talks about the use of philosophy in terms of how we live, what we do. Spinoza's work. It's not a treatise on God. It's not a treatise on the human mind. It's an ethics. It's an exploration of how to live in order to experience blessedness. This is really a really important trajectory. Maybe there are echoes of it in Rousseau later on. it dies down, but then it re-emerges again, perhaps in Nietzsche. Philosophy is a way of life, how we live. And in this respect, I would put Camus in this tradition as well. Let's hear Camus. Camus says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, this is from Camus, comes afterwards. This is a great bit. If I ask myself how to judge that this question is more urgent than that, I reply that one judges by the actions it entails. I have never seen anyone die for the ontological argument. Galileo, who held the scientific truth of great importance, abjured it with the greatest ease as soon as it endangered his life. In a certain sense, he did right. That truth was not worth the stake. This is not Galileo, this is Copernicus. Copernicus, who kind of, what we were discussing him briefly in relation to Montaigne and Montaigne's world. The new worlds that were being understood on planet Earth and in terms of our position within space. On some level, these are important questions. Camus is not denying that. But he's saying on a certain level, we must live. We need something to live for. You know, we might be able to find, you know, some deep sense of solace in looking at the stars, but probably not forever. Not for more than just a few elated moments. Camus is actually quite dismissive of this. We need a reason for living, and it's this kind of search for in the natural science which is not going to provide that. Quote continues. Whether the earth or the sun revolves around the other is a matter of profound indifference. Indifference, remember, that's a Stoic term. To tell the truth, it is a futile question. On the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. Here is another image of the thinker. This again, the thinker is one of our dramatis personae, I suppose, on this course. Roland's the thinker. Sometimes the thinker is on his own, but there's also the thinker in front of the gates of hell. The thinker surrounded by social relations. And I think this is the gates of hell again here. About this question of why we live and what we live for, it involves the need to kind of for care, to care about others and to be cared for, to feel like our actions are of some importance, or that we, you know, in the words of Lacan, Jacques Lacan, much later, Lacan was very influenced by Spinoza, that we act in accordance with the desire that is in us, that we pursue desire, pursue freedom. That activity is so important for someone like Camus as it would be for Beauvoir and Sartre. Now, Camus says in relation to that suicide is the feeling of wanting to die comes as a response to this discovery of the universe's cold, silent indifference. This is where the absurd comes from. It's a conflict between our desire for reason, for order, for logos. That's what the Stoics want, isn't it? But the indifferent silence of the universe. So that's Stoicism is potentially punctured here. So what do we do? The world is meaningless. Well, this is where the feeling that if nothing really matters, we might as well just top ourselves. And this kind of feeling that life is completely empty and purposeless. Is where Camus sees the orientation to suicide coming, and he talks about it actually quite movingly and quite affectingly in a way that, to my mind, shows a deep affinity, a deep understanding of what it means to feel suicidal. That that one takes one's own life, not for reasons that are immediate or obvious, but they're kind of sort of subterranean kind of movements, events. It could be one day a friend is indifferent to a person, and that's enough to kind of to tip one over. But the real movements have kind of been happening over time. the kind of slow series of reflections, conscious and unconscious, that then make our own place within nature seem less and less assured. Now, I talked, well, the heading of this section about hope or suicide, because we can't live in a state of wishing to die, although Camus says that many of us do live in a state like that for a lot of the time. But we need to find refuge, or Spinoza would say, sanctuary in the asylum of ignorance. And that's where religion comes in, organized religion. Faith so important for Pascal. Pascal is a real pessimist, a real fatalist about human nature, but has so much to say about faith. But Camus also sees this as a kind of mental suicide, to give up on reason, to suspend reason in order to kind of be admitted. Kierkegaard is the same as the leap of faith. All of this is suicide in some form for Camus. What Camus wants us to kind of direct philosophy towards is a way that walks through suicide, if that makes sense. Walks through the fact that the universe is indifferent in science, that life is absurd, without consequence, transient. It walks through that, and yet it finds a meaning for itself, not for us, it's for itself afterwards. Not through prayers, not through trying to find redemption in a personal God, but something different. So Camus is quite dismissive about faith. He says, this is later in the Myth of Sisyphus, quote, hope of another life one must deserve, or trickery of those who live not for life itself, but for some great idea that will transcend it, refine it, give it meaning, and betray it. These are things that he's wary of, that he's suspicious of. There's no afterlife that we might deserve. We should be very wary of people that want to give up their lives for a great cause. We might have all sorts of things in mind here. I suppose Camus would have in mind here people that kind of volunteer, for fascism, or volunteer for communism. If we divest ourselves of our own individual freedom, something dangerous and on a basic level irresponsible occurs, because we are responsible for our own freedom, our own desires. At the same time, we cannot hope for nothing more but the exercise and pursuit of this freedom. That's it. As I think it's the philosopher John Martin Fisher says of Spinoza's ethics. This is not Spinoza's ethics. He's talking about freedom and how we should live freely in a way where free will is certainly not assured. He says what matters is not the path itself, like the direction in which the ethical agent walks towards. What matters is not the goal, the end point. What matters, the quote is, what matters is not the path itself, but the way we walk it, the way we live along that path. There's something like this happening in Camus. Well, interesting to briefly compare this with Ecclesiastes. I'm not going to oversell this because I don't know how we can talk about this when we meet. But Camus mentions Ecclesiastes quite briefly in relation to the figure of Don Juan, who we'll talk about in a moment. And he says it's quite false to try to see in Don Juan, who's like a serial womanizer, a seductive man. It is quite false to try to see in Don Juan a man brought up on Ecclesiastes, for nothing is vanity to him except the hope of another life. He proves this because he gambles that afterlife against heaven itself. That Don Juan, in kind of enjoying the kind of romantic sexual conquests of his own time, of the day to day, of the week to week, isn't disturbed by Kohelet's own worries about the fact that nothing outlives us, nothing worthy outlives us under the sun. For Don Juan, and maybe for Camus, the vanity is the belief that there could be something beyond our own mortal coil. That's not possible. That's the absurd, and that's how we live with it. So you might think, is this an adequate response to the despair of Kohelet? This would be an interesting one for us to debate. Okay, in this next part, I want to talk about how Camus might kind of be understood as a kind of Stoic, and then we'll look at some more bits that kind of jeopardize this in different ways. Because you've heard me say so much about the Stoics. I'm wary of saying any more, but let me just proceed. So on this course, the course has a hinge. Part 1 is actual Stoic thinkers. That's the real stuff. And the Greek Stoics, which we looked at through Diogenes Laertius, people like Zeno, Citium on the right, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and others. And then they kind of travelled to Rome indirectly through people like Panaetius and Posidonius, who Cicero was friends with and writes about. Cicero is also a good source on the Greek Stoics. But then in Roman figures like Musonius Rufus, who wants to open up philosophical education to women, to Epictetus, to Seneca, to Marcus Aurelius. Now, I've presented at different points these kind of features of Stoic thinking, so far as I recognise, which kind of are my way of trying to justify the hinge to the second part, which is where we've looked at the Book of Ecclesiastes, we've looked at the Dhammapada attributed to the Buddha. We have looked at Montaigne's essays, in particular off experience, and we've looked at Spinoza's ethics. Concerns in these responses in some of this ancient wisdom literature, and wisdom literature subsequently, about the transience of life. All is breath, all is vanity. And what we do with that. Being like a river, flowing, changing, becoming, but never being the same. One of the ways that separates us Stoics and Stoic type thinkers from the fatalism of, say, Omar Khayyam and Rubaiyat, or even actually part of elements of the Book of Ecclesiastes, is that we can do something, that wisdom is fruitful. Kohelet himself kind of refutes his statement earlier on in Ecclesiastes that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. He seems to believe that wisdom is a kind of protection, is a kind of strength. Wisdom helps us in our training of our disposition and our outlook, to understand what affects us, the causes of our ideas, as Spinoza would say, to train our disposition so that we can experience more lasting joys. Also, the concern about fate. One of the reasons why the Greek Stoics' ideas, which were voluminous in our own time, no longer exist for us, is that they were allowed to be destroyed. They do not exist. They were not allowed to survive. They were not allowed to be taught, because they didn't conform with Christianity in any way, nor did the writings of Epictetus, which were also copious and do not survive. It's not that these guys didn't philosophize, they sure did. But the problem with their doctrines is that they are rigorously materialistic. Yes, there is this kind of mention of the gods in Epictetus and elsewhere, but the gods don't really have that much kind of influence or power at all. This, in some ways, could be read as a way of, simply trying to kind of appease and present oneself as hospitable to the cultural status quo. For our Stoics, and this is what made them so dangerous in early modern Europe, they believe in determinism, that everything in nature is determined by prior causes, that therefore free will, so important to the Christian tradition, is meaningless, doesn't exist. That then presents a challenge about how do you talk about freedom in different ways. For Democritus, for the followers of Democritus, Epicurus, you have the swerve, the idea that the atoms swirling around can randomly swerve at different points, and this kind of random swerves creates the possibility of kind of chance and agency. I like the fact that our Stoics are not enchanted by this image either. Our freedom is so limited for someone like Zeno of Citium. Zeno and Chrysippus give the image of a dog being pulled by a cart. Does the dog struggle, or does the dog walk with the cart that is pushed? Sometimes there's very little that we can do about fate. As Friedrich Nietzsche would say, who had more in common with the Stoics than he presents, I think, we must learn to love fate, amor fati, accept what happens. And perhaps within that is a very limited kind of freedom. In being aware of what happens to us by fate, our mind itself kind of, as Chrysippus says, our mind's properties change. We become more able to withstand things that we would otherwise be driven by. In that sense, it can be fated to become more capable, to increase our capacity of acting through learning and understanding, as Spinoza would think. And previously, in his early kind of process of Stoic thinking, we talked about self-knowledge, compassion, and living with nature. Okay, so how does this kind of relate to Camus? Let's try and make some links. So at first, it seems kind of difficult, uncertain, unsure. So here are some kind of thoughts about Camus being a Stoic. So at first, the absurd begins in terms of this struggle for meaning, the unceasing struggle. Now, our mind needs reason, but nature is not hospitable to it, because even the idea of a harmonious, fixed nature seems to be something that the absurd does not allow in different ways. We're in a desert. Now, there could be, I think, something quite Stoic in Camus' response. Neither fatalism, not eat, drink, and be merry, as in Ecclesiastes, but in what he himself calls in the Myth of Sisyphus in one place, askesis, in exercise, in the training of oneself, in the care and development of oneself in response to the absurd, in response to transience, in response to death, in response to the tug of suicide. To live well, to live fully. And there's a kind of morality in the Myth of Sisyphus to live with integrity, with dignity, to live with pride, to live in a self-determined way, to live without illusions, to live without being deluded, to live with a kind of compassion, to live in a way that is deeply engaged in what happens in the world. Camus writes, I do not want to found anything on the incomprehensible. I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone. I am told again that here the intelligence must sacrifice its pride and reason bow down. But if I recognize the limits of the reason, I do not therefore negate it, recognizing its relative powers. I merely want to remain in this middle path where the intelligence can remain clear. I think this is a really interesting remark. A middle path, one that doesn't abandon reason or reasoning. It just simply recognizes that what reason can understand of the universe isn't one that is accommodating with sentimentality, isn't accommodating with human wishes. We get this in Freud's civilization and its discontents, has a similar vision of the cold, uncaring universe and our response to it. Maybe you think I'm just a hard sell here. We could make a comparison with the way that Marcus Aurelius talks about the need to establish an inner citadel, or Montaigne, a back room, a kind of a quiet place of solitary reflection that is non-attached. Some people might say it's detached, where we can recognize things for what they are and we can reason about them. Camus writes, before encountering the absurd, the everyday man lives with aims, a concern for the future or for justification with regard to whom or what is not the question. He weighs his chances. He counts on someday his retirement or the labour of his sons. He still thinks that something in his life can be directed. In truth, he acts as if he were free. But at that moment, I am well aware that that higher liberty, that freedom to be, which alone can serve as basis for a truth, does not exist. Death is there as the only reality. Now, in Camus, as we've seen in Marcus and in Seneca here, there is this kind of rebuke of a life dedicated to transient pursuits, like the pursuit of wealth or honour, say, when it Camus refers to the pride in one's sons or retirement. There's no real lasting freedom in this. Freedom of the mind that Camus envisions is a freedom that kind of recognises the fact of death very early on. That philosophy is a training for dying. But uses that as a way to live fully, to live one's life in a committed way, in an engaged way. I think there are some resonances here with Seneca in the reading that we looked at. It must have been about a month ago, on the shortness of life, which we looked at in its full. Again, there's a discussion here that we shouldn't fear death; we should face it. But it's because we fear death, we don't want to think about it, that we busy ourselves in kind of tedious everyday pursuits that consume our time. But why don't we make use of our time adequately and properly? Nature's given us a lot of time. Of course, there's a question about time for what, and time in what way, and what Seneca advocates is a contemplative life. It's a life that Montaigne enjoyed in his tower, a life of reflection. This might not be a life that appeals to all of us. We might want a life that involves more space for social engagement, political commitments, romantic engagements, time spent with friends. That's not to say that either Seneca or Montaigne denied this, but what they're trying to make space for is some time for thinking, for meditating, for reflecting. That surely is a good we can all agree on. Now, so on this work that we discussed on the shortness of life is kind of looking at how and why we postpone our dreams for future years. How we try not to think about death. We try not to think about our fate, which is to die sooner than we want. And Seneca also makes this distinction between existing and living. On a day-to-day level, we just exist. We subsist, doing things that we don't particularly like or enjoy, and we put off the things that we really want for later. You might be thinking, well, that was easy for Seneca to say because he was, very wealthy. Well, it's true that Seneca is very wealthy, but might it also be true that there's, we have open to us time during our week at certain points in our life in certain years, where we could travel, where we could decide to, stop working or change our jobs, or to kind of do something that, really matters to our hearts, to live for our hearts. Maybe that's not always, that space for meditation and reflection on our own is not simply always a privilege of the wealthy. It's something that we might find ways to manage. But what it kind of relies on is that our own self-affirmation and self-determination takes place not through the acquisition of money or possessions, but through developing our minds. That, I suppose, is really what's happening here. And for Seneca, there's a lot of stuff about how important it is to study philosophy. And so we get this kind of stirring bit in On the Shortness of Life, where he's kind of telling us to sort of wake up. He's addressing this to I think it's his father-in-law. We wait. Why do we wait until we retire before we do stuff that we really want to do? He says, aren't you ashamed to keep for yourself just the remnants of your life, and to devote to wisdom only that time which cannot be spent on any business? How late it is to begin really to live just when life must end. How stupid to forget our mortality. Now maybe there's something similar happening here in Camus, forgetting our mortality, not wanting to confront our mortality, confront the absurd. And if we don't therefore find refuge in the intellectual suicide of religion and faith, then to just simply preoccupy ourselves with the day-to-day, living in a way, in what maybe Sartre would call an inauthentic life. This also comes up later in the Myth of Sisyphus. Camus says, we live on the future, tomorrow, later on, when you have made your way. You will understand when you are old enough. Such irrelevancies are wonderful, for after all it's a matter of dying. Yet a day comes when a man notices or says that he is 30. The existential moment. It's no longer 50s or 60s, it's a 30. But the point is the same, isn't it? That we preoccupy ourselves with dreaming. We're dreaming for tomorrow, for postponing our desires, not acting on our desires. Let's bring in Jacques Lacan again. This is also from the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, which I think is Seminar 7. He says that the boring morality of the authorities about desire is carry on working, work must go on. Carry on postponing and deferring your desires, what you really want. This is the morality of authority, to keep us working, keep us in check. But Seneca, Lacan, Camus, James Dean, we're all calling on us in different ways to live in this moment, to occupy this moment, to live and to not merely exist, and to use kind of death and our mortality as a spur towards this. This here is a bit of graffiti before my time, associated with King Mob, I think in Ladbroke Grove along the tube line. I think from the 70s, late 60s, 70s. You'll see it here on the wall. A kind of a statement that seems to come straight out of Camus, along the Westway. Same thing day after day, Tube, work, dinner, work, tube, armchair, TV, sleep, tube, work. How much more can you take? 1 in 10 go mad. 1 in 5 cracks up. Camus in the Myth of Sisyphus writes, it happens that the stage sets collapse. Remember, Camus is interested in theatre. Rising, bus, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, bus, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Begins, this is important. And it really is important, isn't it? Begins, because what we're getting in Camus, what we get in Seneca is a call to a change in our behavior, a change in how we live, to be open and responsive to mortality so that we can live more richly and more fully, but not in a prescriptive way. Camus is talking about how thought begins from the confrontation with the absurd, and later on he'll kind of present some kind of things that the absurd must cling to in ways that it mustn't give up on its newfound freedom, however kind of vertigo-like this freedom is. But there are ways in which Camus differs from the Stoics too. There's a kind of romanticism in parts of the Myth of Sisyphus, a kind of rebuke of what the Stoics called physics, of the natural sciences. We had that earlier with that cracking line about the ontological argument. Camus writes, this is early in the Myth of Sisyphus, and he's talking about like a love of nature here. The soft lines of these hills and the hand of evening on this troubled heart teach me much more than the natural sciences. This heart within me I can feel, and I judge that it exists. This world I can touch, and I likewise judge that it exists. There ends all my knowledge, and the rest is construction. You'll notice I put Montaigne in brackets there. Let me just connect something up. Sounds like my laptop's having a confrontation with the absurd there. Because this kind of harking back to experience as the only criterion for authority, which when we discussed Montaigne was felt as a not very philosophical position, and others argue that it was a philosophical position. I think it's a philosophical position. This isn't quite Stoic, is it? Because the Stoics are trying to understand humanity's place within nature as a natural being, as a thing of nature. And so that's what ethics is one part of that. There's also logic being not just about logic as we understand it now, but epistemology and the conditions of knowing, the conditions of truth, of verifying and demonstrating truth. They had a real interest in arguments, logical arguments. But also physics, that if we're going to understand and live according to nature, we need to understand exactly what nature is. So the place of the heart is relegated, it's diminished. This seems especially true of the Greek Stoics, to an extent too of the Roman Stoics. They don't tend to speak about other people. Other people seem to be a burden, a danger. But that's largely because they can be lost. They can be cruelly taken away by disease, like the plagues that swept through Italy, like during Marcus's own time. Children often died. Beloved wives died in childbirth. That kind of non-attachment or detachment that we see in their own thought exercises reflects a different kind of period. But what we get in Camus and what we get in Montaigne is this attention to the heart, to feeling, to the passions, as Spinoza would say. But Camus is more avowedly against physics in the Stoic sense. Once we go beyond what we can feel and what we judge exists, everything else is vague, it's undefinable. Camus says it's like water slipping through my fingers. And water is a very important image for us on this course. Water comes up every week. You're thinking, huh? Water is in flows. Heraclitus, the river that we step in that changes each time. That life is constantly defined by movement and activity, by exchanges of energy, continuous becoming. But becoming isn't always in one direction. Becoming is also destruction, generation, regeneration and degeneration, birth and death. We can't emphasize one without the other. Camus doesn't accept any form of providence. And he seems to kind of find a freedom by being released from the possibility that his reason could definitively understand nature beyond him. In one part he writes, "There is no future. Henceforth, this is the reason for my inner freedom. The absurd man feels released from everything outside that passionate attention crystallizing in him." Okay. Right, in this final part, we're going to look at rebellion. Hopefully, the screen won't rebel through this. So, think about Camus' own life, his activity in the French Resistance, his discomfort around the Algerian War of Independence, his refusal to conform to most forms of political orthodoxy. He writes about being a rebel, the rebel, when it comes out in 1951. But he also writes about rebellion and revolt in the Myth of Sisyphus too, which 9 years earlier. There's this question of how does rebellion emerge? How and why? How does revolt emerge? And revolt is really important. It's part of our reaction, our active responses to absurdity. And what Camus does later in the Myth of Sisyphus is he presents these different characters who respond to the absurd in different ways. And we'll talk about this in a moment. Camus writes, "An attempt is made to get him to admit his guilt. He feels innocent. To tell the truth, that is all he feels, his irreparable, like unrepairable, innocence. This is what allows him everything. Hence, what he demands of himself is to live solely with what he knows, to accommodate himself to what is, and to bring in nothing that is not certain. He is told that nothing is, but this, at least, is a certainty, and it is with this that he is concerned. He wants to find out if it is possible to live without appeal." He italicizes without appeal in the text. Without appeal, without appealing to a form of authority beyond oneself. Think about Kafka being barred access, without appeal to a form of universal morality, without appeal to God. This is the ways in which revolt exists. In another instance, Camus writes, "It was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living and experience a particular fate is accepting it fully." And then later, "One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity." Now, this condition of revolt can be passionate. It can be contradictory. It's a striving to find one's own meaning. It can be doomed. It can be tragic. Hamlet, we talked about him a little bit a couple of weeks ago. Hamlet, a quotation from Hamlet that Jacques Derrida kind of reads a lot in much later on. I think this is from Spectres of Marx. Hamlet says, "Time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that I was ever born to set it right." Now, when we talked about Hamlet, we talked about Hamlet's anger. Hamlet's kind of rage at being driven by different forces, driven to revenge, driven by events that are beyond his control. Hamlet, who isn't a Stoic, he's a bad Stoic. Well, he's just not a bad Stoic, he's just not a Stoic. Because he doesn't try to use reason to kind of master the passions. He's kind of driven about by fate, really. And that's what tragedy is. It's interesting that Seneca is such a great Stoic, but also a great tragedian. Because in tragedies, the characters are driven by things beyond their control. And Stoic thinking is also, in many ways, a training in that. A training to live with what is up to us, which sometimes is very little at all. Now, we saw in the earlier parts of this recording that Camus is calling on us to face the uncaring universe. He calls it a waterless desert. He calls it like a desert. Thinking in a desert, there's no objective meanings. Now, we've got suicidal as a challenge to face the desert, face what has no meaning, to live through it, but not just to live through it like we're wounded, like we're sunken, like we're ghosts, but to live through it passionately, to be alive as a result of it. Camus talks about this being a kind of freedom that is, quote, not the best living, but the most living. It's like Nietzsche's amor fati, love of fate. Camus writes, thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. And passion is important. This comes up with the character of Don Juan, who we mentioned earlier as a refutation to Ecclesiastes. Don Juan the seducer. Now, what Camus does later when he presents these different, he presents three people who respond to the absurd in ways that one can kind of learn from. It's interesting that actually later in the Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir also kind of comes up with these kind of stock characters, these stock types who represent different responses to freedom. For Camus, it's Don Juan, the serial seducer, and then it's the actor, and then it's the conqueror. Now, Don Juan, the seducer, here, he's not sad that his life has no meaning. He doesn't feel like he's missing out because he hasn't spent lots of time studying Spinoza's ethics or the Bible, because he lives for pleasure in the present. He's not concerned. He's not worried about the future. Camus sees this as one kind of response to the absurd, an embracing of it, an activity within it. Another is the actor. The actor, remember, acting is important for our Greek Stoics, who say that you don't know what role you're going to be given by the director, but you should act all roles well. Camus says something similar. The actor has to live and must succeed in living different lives. But he's thinking here not of the actor in a film, but an actor on stage for a production that is never recorded in any way. Who's going to remember those performances? Well, he might remember them a little bit, but it'll always be a bit vague, a bit foggy. The actor must therefore act in the present. They don't have the illusion that they're going to be remembered. They're not concerned about posterity. That's important. That's one of the kind of ways that Camus thinks we need to kind of respond. We need to confront the absurd. The military conqueror is enough. I don't think Camus is quite fair in this respect. We might want to think in not just of like a conqueror, like Marcus Aurelius, squashing German tribes, but anybody involved in a military struggle. They could also be like the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. Those who kind of live in the present, who struggle for short-term gains in the present, but they know that long-term gains of territory are impossible. That everything is changing. That one actively fights in the here and now. One strives in the here and now. One enjoys the here and now. That's, I'll ask you this question: what unites all of these different figures? There's this active striving, there's this energy, but in all of them there's a kind of way of life, I suppose. That's how Camus reads it. A way of life in which we live with transience, we live with fate, but we refuse eternal ideals. We refuse eternal universal meanings. We accept, like a coherent narrative of Ecclesiastes, the transience, the vanity of existence. But we're not sunk by it either. We do not wish to kill ourselves as a result of this. We instead wish to live our lives as we have them now. And with that too is a kind of self-overcoming, an askesis, as Camus calls it, a training or an exercise to do this living, to live well, without sinking back into authoritarian creeds and credos. Now, Camus also says a bit, I'm going to start wrapping up soon, about the absurd work of art and what absurdism in art would be like. Again, keep in mind here his interest in theatre, his work on theatre, his novels. Now, the absurd artist isn't somebody who tries to, be like Dickens and, produce social realism. Because the world is constantly changing. What is in the world is ephemeral. Everything is passing. We shouldn't try and describe something that is never going to remain the same. We shouldn't try and offer a realistic portrayal that is meant to, speak to all perspectives and all minds, because that's not possible. The universe cannot accommodate that. What's instead happening in one's effort to portray realistically is simply one's own vision that one presents in a way that one hopes is pleasing or conforms with others. The danger for Camus is that this results in sentimental and mediocre art. And so the absurd artist for Camus is somebody who doesn't want to portray the world as other people see it, but as they themselves see it. in a way that is defiant. And in a way that also kind of involves this kind of sense that the works are not going to survive forever. These are works that make an intervention and an interruption now. And that's all they do. But creation is also a very important act for the thinker of the absurd. It's part of our exercise and discovery of who we are and what we are. And it involves pleasure and joy too. Think of Montaigne writing his essays. Camus writes, and the quotations in front of you, of all the schools of patience and lucidity, creation is the most effective. It is also the staggering evidence of man's sole dignity, the dogged revolt against his condition, perseverance in an effort considered sterile. It calls for a daily effort, self-mastery. Self-mastery, that's Stoic, isn't it? A precise estimate of the limits of truth, measure and strength. It constitutes an askesis, all that for nothing, in order to repeat and mark time. Which I suppose in different ways has a bearing on the figure that this is named after, Camus' own parable. We've had parables earlier from Kafka and Dostoevsky that Camus himself discusses these writers in different ways elsewhere. But what is Sisyphus meant to represent in this? Somebody who affirms his freedom, affirms his own activity in confrontation with and in spite of the forces that are fated to act against him, even dreadfully tragic ones, like being condemned to push a stone up a hill. We've got to imagine Sisyphus happy, that's the injunction. Camus writes, thus convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, a blind man eager to see who knows that the night has no end, he is still on the go, the rock is still rolling. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. That's an important bit. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's a difficult injunction, isn't it? To imagine a freedom or agency within that. But it's an activity that isn't a million miles away from Epictetus' book. To recognise what is up to us, which for Sisyphus isn't very much at all. All he can do is push a stone up a hill. Now, does he do it willingly or not? Think of Zeno and Chrysippus, the dog tied to a cart that is being pushed along by someone else. Does the dog run with it or run against it? Now, some of you might think it's not fair for a dog to be tied up to a cart, so he should struggle against it and maybe he will break free. And that's enough way of reading that analogy. But Camus takes a slightly tragic view of human nature, that we are determined by things beyond our control. We see this in Spinoza, we see this in the Stoics as well. You might think, why doesn't Sisyphus stop pushing the stone up the hill? He can't. He's fated. It's fated. In that sense, Nietzsche misrepresents the Stoics. They don't have this kind of entirely rose-tinted perspective of nature. There is this recognition of nature's awful power and of what nature takes from us and will take from us through the loss of the people that we care about, which we see a lot in our own Stoics. Now, Camus' work turns to the figure of the rebel later on. I mentioned the rebel earlier, and then his kind of involvement to what's happening in Algeria. Now, when Camus talks about living without appeal, it's something that maybe escapes the existing political parties of his day and as they stand. It's an effort, a striving, a beginning to find self-sufficiency, self-determination, without falling back on transcendent ideas, without wanting to give up one's life for an ideal, for the party. And so Sisyphus is a hero because he carries on, I guess, with resilience. I know that's a modern shitty word. With pride, with pleasure. He faces the world, but he doesn't give in. He fights on in an engaged way. He doesn't, stupefy himself. He just keeps pushing with purpose, with compassion. So the question goes, are you sympathetic to this interpretation? Do you see much that is useful for rebellion in this? Now, Camus in his life, he's involved in different struggles. He's involved in communist groups, anarchist groups, French resistance. And in the essay, The Rebel, he talks about how revolt is fundamental to our freedom. What the rebel does is it's an ethics, it's an ethical struggle. They commit themselves to the common good. They commit themselves to other people, to the dignity of other people, and to the intrinsic value of life, which is interesting because you could take some of the arguments in the Myth of Sisyphus and, kind of derive an amorality around them. You could, find a position like Ayn Rand, that, everything is competition and drives and striving, and that's all that there really is. But Camus goes in a totally different direction, towards compassion, towards dignity. In his essay, The Rebel, there's this wonderful line that appears: I rebel, therefore we exist. It's kind of overturning of I think, therefore I am, isn't it? That our own self-worth is achieved, it's realized in our commitment to other people, in our solidarity with others, in our commitment to a community, in our commitment to something that is beyond us in different ways. So this sometimes makes Camus a bit hard to place politically because he doesn't condone any form of political violence. He is against all forms of violent terrorism. So you might think, what about the kind of resistance, French resistance? Well, he's not against that. He's editing the newspaper for this publication. That would be seen, I suppose, as a struggle against fascism, as a struggle against death. But when it comes to Algeria, he's wary. He presents it in a very everyday way. He says, how can he, openly condone terrorism in a city of Algiers when his mother might be traveling on a bus that gets blown up? And so later on in the 50s, he kind of argues towards European cooperation, integration, and pacifism. This comes up in an essay called Neither Victims Nor Executioners. And he says, quote, I will never again be one of those, whoever they be, who compromise with murder. This is a real rebuke of Sartre. Okay, right, let's start rounding up. I'm not sure how long this one has been, probably too long. So what does Camus have to say about the absurd? So, the absurd worldview is one in which all forms of meaning, think of Kafka, have collapsed, God, and so on. Human life is defined by death and transience, by suffering. Think of the Buddha. A kind of anxiety, the inevitability about death. But there isn't this retreat away from wisdom that we see in the Book of Ecclesiastes. Instead, we've got to face this stuff. We don't want to just fall into despair and just aim to just drink wine, find some form of intoxication. The bringing of knowledge involves the bringing of sorrow, if we take Ecclesiastes, but we can use the power of reason to kind of confront and understand this anti-human, non-human nature. It calls for a lucid recognition that existence is absurd, but that we can still live. We can live well. Once we strip the scales away from our eyes, once we recognize how good this life in front of us is, this present is, rather than the deferred future. Our relationships with others, the things that cause us pleasure, our joys, our living with other people, different forms of collective. All of this is present in Camus. And in that sense, I don't think that if Camus were in the Stoa Poikile in Athens in 400 BC and presented his view of the absurd, I'm not sure how much Zeno would really disagree with that. This dismantling of the gods, of the idols, of the old world. The sense that nature is driven by things well beyond human power, by tragic events and adversity, and that the goal of the philosopher is to understand these and to cultivate wisdom, cultivate their own reason, their own understanding of nature, and to live in accordance with nature as it is, not as we would like it to be, without blame. That's what Zeno says, that's what Chrysippus says, and that's what Camus says. So maybe you're hoping for Camus to debunk the Stoics, and I've really disappointed you, I'm sorry. Okay, so we'll meet again on Monday. I want us to cover these questions. What does Camus mean by the absurd? How does absurdity present a challenge to traditional morality and philosophy? And is Camus a Stoic or not? How does what you've read, what you think, resonate with other approaches on this course? So I've made a lot of comparisons in this recording. We'll discuss things between 1 and 3, and then in our final week, also partly through popular demand, not Viktor Frankl himself, but some other stuff that I'm going to squeeze in. So our final week, we're going to look at Viktor Frankl, a contemporary of Camus, a Jewish man, a psychotherapist in Vienna in the 1930s, who survives a number of different Nazi concentration camps. He writes about his experiences. Man's Search for Meaning comes out in 1946. How he looks at horrific suffering, and he looks at how people psychologically, personally survive that in different ways. And there's a broader question about how we establish meaning in life in the face of the worst suffering. How meaning is made through living, and as Frankl will say, through loving, through love. We'll look at some Stoic resonances. You know, Frankl had a lot of time for the Stoics. But then this is through popular demand. When I gave you that poll, a lot of you wanted Foucault and Nussbaum in there. I mean, Jesus, how am I going to fit all this in? So I'm going to talk a little bit about Foucault's ideas about the self in a short piece called Self-Writing. And then I'm going to bring in some more for Nussbaum, a part of the therapy of desire. We're basically going to use this week to kind of round up on some themes as well. So let's see what we think. Will we be Stoics by the end, or after Camus and Nietzsche, have you no time for this stuff? Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.